I'm Fonzo.
And I'm Eliza.
And we're the co-host of Grown, a podcast from the Moth that shows we're never fully grown.
Growing up feels like a phase that should end at some point, but does it ever really? Whether you're 16 or 26 or 86, you're gonna have to deal with family drama, your body, and the type of person you want to be. So why not put it all out in the open and go through it together?
Join us every other week to deal with cringe, culture, and the courageous efforts of people like you to get grown.
Start listening today. Follow Grown on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now.
Travel with me to Moordale Secondary School.
I'm worried about you, man. Everybody's either thinking about shagging, about to shag, or actually shagging.
It is the fictional setting for the Netflix show Sex Education. The premise: an awkward British 16-year-old virgin whose mom is a sex therapist starts a business on campus with a friend. It's a makeshift sex clinic where he gives out advice to his peers.
I think that you need to own your narrative, not let it control you. Yes, you have a large appendage. And yes, you're very visible in the school due to your father's position, but neither is likely to change. But your outlook can. Does that make sense?
Not really.
It shouldn't matter what anyone in the school thinks. You are who you are. Don't let anyone take that away from you. Be proud of your penis and your heritage, because neither are going anywhere. You should work with what you've got.
I am a sucker for a good coming-of-age story and a peek into high school life that I can enjoy but not relive. So the premise pulled me in. But I stayed because the show speaks to both young me and adult me at the same time. It gave me some sex ed I needed decades ago, reminded me that I have got to put in the work to explore and then communicate about my own pleasure. And it made me hopeful that we can keep building toward a universe in which we all feel a bit more free in our bodies. This is Embodied, our show about sex, relationships, and your health. I'm Anita Rao. A quick warning before we continue. Today's episode contains discussion of sexual assault. Please pause now if you need to. Sex Education, the show, gave to me what it gave to many of y'all. Lessons you wish you'd learned at least a decade earlier.
One of my favorite aspects of the show is how normal teen sexuality is portrayed to be. I grew up in a context that I would describe as purity culture adjacent. Teen sexuality was only ever talked about to me in the context of some kind of tragedy. I never really knew that there was a healthy way to explore my sexuality as a teenager because all of those narratives were about pregnancy and about STIs and not really about how sexuality is a normal part of human experience regardless of your age.
I went to high school in the late 2000s as far as it goes, and I think my sex education was very much what was considered, quote unquote, the normal sex ed, where it's just between a man and a woman. There was no other discussion about any other type of sex, anything else that could come up in those frames, and I think especially the conversations you watch these characters have about the awkwardness of having sex either for the first time or trying something different and new and being open to it is a really accurate portrayal of what it's like to be. I mean, for myself as a millennial, it's a representation of something that is so real that we've never seen in a TV show before.
One of the things I love most is that it is so effortlessly diverse in terms of sexual orientation and identification, extremely diverse. Race and ethnicity, extremely diverse. That is one of the best things about this show. They normalize everyone, and they make it possible to root for everyone.
You just heard from our show producer Audrey Smith and listeners Kendall Umetsu and Chris Watkins. For writer and filmmaker Drew Gregory, one of the real-life sex ed takeaways from this show was that it taught her how to masturbate. She said as much in a review she wrote for the digital publication Autostraddle. We loved her takes on the show so much, we wanted to hear more.
I think it does a really great job at being a teen show and getting into the ways that teenagers, need to learn about sex, need to learn about their own sexualities. But also, that's a lifelong journey, especially for those of us who, didn't get the sex education we needed as teenagers. And I think most of us have had to have an experience of like sort of checking in and thinking about our own pleasure and thinking about, the ways in which we're performing to a certain extent instead of being present when it comes to sex. And I think, things like queerness, transness just compound on top of that. But it's such like a powerful idea that, we all deserve to be present in our sex lives.
Before Drew became a superfan, she was a tad skeptical about yet another coming-of-age story focusing on a straight, white, cisgender boy. But once she started watching Sex Education, the parallels between this show and her own life began to surprise her.
It sort of struck me that when I was a teenager, I didn't know that I was trans. And so my experience in this skewed sort of way, like I had a lot in common with Otis, and especially this character who is a cis straight white boy, but is also very sensitive and very tender and a great listener. And I was like, oh, this is hitting very close to home.
You were also a peer counselor in high school. So you were kind of providing advice for students who didn't feel comfortable opening up to adults about their questions. So how were the parallels between how you connected to your peers and how you see Otis try to connect to his through this sex clinic?
Yeah, it's interesting because the peer counseling program at my school was something that a lot of people did just sort of like to put it on their resume for like college applications. But I took it so seriously. I really felt like I understood the purpose of it, and the health of the school was like on my shoulders, which, was, I think in part was me sort of avoiding confronting my own queerness, my own other problems. And so I really talked to a lot of people, and a lot of people who didn't even go like through the proper peer counseling channels, but just, knew that I was a peer counselor and would sort of be like, hey, can I talk to you? But I just like had this sense of responsibility that I think, again, was coming from a place of maybe a little bit of avoidance of self.
Well, that brings me to the point that, he's still a teenager. So while he's filling this gap that he sees that, his peers need more sex ed than they're getting in school, he doesn't always know how to give the best advice and sometimes makes errors and faults. And this also resonated with you about kind of wanting to support your peers, but also feeling like sometimes you didn't know where to go. Talk to me about that and kind of what the show opens up about this need that young people have for a space to process openly.
I feel for both myself and for my peers, I just felt this real lack in how sex was being talked about, how relationships were being talked about, how our feelings were being talked about. And I think Otis acknowledges that and sees that too. But, like he's still a teenager. I was still a teenager. Teenagers are kids. And, even adults don't always know the right things to say or like the right ways to feel or whatever. And so when you're a kid, especially, there's just so much uncertainty. And there are limits, right? There are limits to what a teen can say to another teen or can acknowledge about themselves. And I think it's both really important that we grant teenagers like their full personhood and really listen to their desires. But there could be a support system there from adults that I just don't think exists in most high schools around, the world.
If you caught our episode last week, you met some teens who are trying to connect their peers to supportive resources. But that's certainly not available in most high schools. While Otis and his makeshift sex clinic at Moordale sometimes fails in giving the best advice, his mom is a real licensed sex therapist. And through her, we see what it can look like to get support around some of our most traumatic and vulnerable sexual experiences. Here's a peek inside a session between Jean Milburn and Otis's peer, Amy. Amy was riding a bus to school when she noticed a man behind her masturbating. He ejaculated on her pants. And in the moment, she brushes it off, but it has some big and lasting ramifications. And eventually, she seeks support.
Do you feel comfortable telling me a little bit about why you're here?
Last term, I was sexually assaulted, and I thought that I was getting over it, but I don't think I am. I used to like my body, and I used to like having sex, but ever since it happened, I don't like the way my body feels. I don't like looking at it, and I don't like my boyfriend touching it anymore.
That must be difficult for you, Amy. Do you think you could tell me a little bit more about the assault?
I was going to school, and everything felt normal. And then I got on the bus, and there was this man. Sorry, I just find it hard to talk about it sometimes.
It's okay. We don't have to talk about anything you don't want to.
I just want to be the old me again.
Well, you may never be the old you, Amy. But that's okay. As human beings, we are constantly changing and developing. And by processing this trauma, you may gain clarity on the event itself, and we can move you towards healing the relationship with your body again. Would you like that?
Yeah, I'd like that.
I really appreciated the nuance that was brought to this storyline, and I think we have this collective mental image of sexual assault on screen that doesn't necessarily align with a lot of the experiences of sexual assault in real life. And I think it's such a sharp choice of like what this experience is for Amy. This idea that like she's on a bus surrounded by a lot of other people, her clothes remain on, we don't have to go to the most extreme portrayal of sexual assault to show that this character is deeply affected by this experience. It's not to say that the way that sexual assault is often shown on screen, that, instances like that don't happen as well, obviously. But I think even when that is shown, the psychological toll isn't often shown. So to have this be the encounter and to see how much it affects Amy, I think is really powerful.
Yeah, they do a really nice job kind of weaving it back. So it's not just an arc that kind of evolves over the course of 1 to 2 episodes, but it keeps showing up for her in various ways when she tries to get intimate with her partner, her relationships with her friends. And I think that kind of holistic representation felt very unique to me. But there was also a moment where several of the characters, including Amy, are in detention together, and they're tasked with figuring out the one thing that they all have in common. And that was a moment where you felt like the way the storyline was portrayed missed the mark, and you felt let down by it. So take me into that.
Yeah, so that happens in season 2, and the collective answer they come up with is quote unquote male genitalia. And Lily is actually the character who says that, and Lily's so far been shown to be a character who's not just queer, but also just like very sexually open. And so to hear her especially make that connection felt disappointing, especially when the show is so sharp when it comes to sex and gender usually. I had an experience on the subway where a man like put his penis on me and like peed down my back, and I'm like, it wasn't his penis, it was the man, right? And by acting like it is a certain genitalia, not only does a disservice to trans women, but also gives an excuse to people who are predatory. It gives them like a biological out that I don't think they deserve. So I wrote about that and wrote about like, the ways in which season 2 was such an exceptional season of television, and at the same time feeling like, am I not like a part of this world of, sexual openness and conversation?
No show hits the mark all the time. Drew has friends who have TV shows and has spent time on sets herself and knows just how hard it is to make a show like this with a big ensemble cast, multiple seasons, and so many moving parts. For a TV show to win her over, she doesn't ask for perfection, but openness to critique and continued expansion. And that she thinks this show has nailed, especially in the 3rd season.
As the episodes go along, as the seasons go along, you just get such a wider portrait of different identities. And yeah, in season 3, Cal's introduced, who is non-binary, and outside of film and TV shows that are specifically focused on trans people, specifically written and directed by trans people, this was one of the best storylines I've ever seen from just like an ensemble show being made largely, by cis people. And it's not just the casting, because I think that's something that has become sort of more of a rule that like trans parts should be cast with trans actors, but deeper than that, like the fact that there are two non-binary characters who are introduced, and we see the different ways that they deal with the oppression they face. And also Cal feels like a person and the ways that people interact with Cal show their transphobia, but we're always on Cal's side. We're always like from Cal's point of view. And if audiences want to learn through the show, they can, but the show isn't catering to their perspective. It's catering to Cal's perspective. And I think the show always does such a good job at that, of both providing teaching opportunities, but centering the humanity of the characters first and foremost.
I couldn't have said it better myself. That, in a sentence, is one of many things that is just so good about this show. As a viewer, you learn and are exposed to diverse people and identities, but you never feel like any character is tokenized. The show takes representation really seriously. The creator, Lori Nunn, has brought intimacy coordinators on set to help with sex scenes, and made sure to continue to diversify and expand her writer's room. But one place where that representation is exaggerated for effect is the depiction of the life of a sex therapist.
I think one of the biggest differences in our offices is that most sex therapists will not have their offices decked out in penises and vulvas and bodies. And part of that is to help it be a really accessible, neutral space.
Rosera Teresi is a sex therapist and the founding director at the Long Island Institute of Sex Therapy. She loves how this show gets at the humanity of her job, how you can have so much going on in your personal life, but still really show up for your clients. The way Jean navigates privacy and confidentiality, on the other hand, is certainly overstepping in ways that she wouldn't. But there are many scenes that have her vigorously nodding her head in recognition, like this one.
This is good. It's really helpful being in the water, isn't it? It's just buoying us up and we're really figuring out how our bodies can intertwine. It's working well for me. Is it working for you? No.
Well, like I said before, I am a sex and relationship therapist.
You are a teenager with an inflated sense of self-importance.
Right. Well, I have a hunch that this is more to do with your relationship than your physical intimacy. How's your communication?
We've known each other since primary school and we talk for hours. Might help.
Interesting. How long have you guys been together?
About 4 months. We both came out around the same time and it just happened.
Interesting.
Look, I'm sure you find lots of things interesting, but our problem was with the sex, not the relationship, so we're just going to figure this out on our own.
Well, I'll come back when you're ready to talk about your relationship. Good session, team. Great progress.
So that scene is wonderful for a few reasons. One is, especially for sex therapists, we're often working with somatics or the body. And when we get our clients moving sometimes, that helps other things come to light. And on top of that, what makes this a really great scene is that so many people come to sex therapy saying, sex is the issue, that's why we're coming to you. And I'm the first to say, okay, I'm a sex therapist. I'm a hammer and the rest of the world is a nail. A nail is sex. Everything's about sex to me. But sometimes it's actually not about the sex. So sometimes in terms of what really is going on is the relational, is the communication, is somebody's own personal development and where they're at, spirituality, someone's individual trauma. There's so much going on that isn't overtly sexual, but is impacting the sex. And we do need to still talk about that.
One of the things I think this show models really well is being able to have conversations with people about sex when they don't necessarily have the language to talk about it in a way that maybe an adult would. And I think because Otis is a peer, he can relate to them on that level. But I'm curious for you, the way that you saw young folks being supported through these important sexual experiences as teenagers and how that related to some of the work that you do, talking to young folks and meeting them where they are in terms of their development.
Sure. So, one of the things that I also do is teach ninth grade sex ed as part of my congregation. So, it's comprehensive sexuality education in a religious setting, which is the coolest thing. In all of these years of teaching my ninth graders, we have something called a question box where they're able to put anonymous questions, and the show does an amazing job of tackling the questions that I get year after year after year. Am I normal? What happens if I like somebody and they don't like me? What if I'm gay? What if my friends want me to be doing this thing and I'm not really interested in it? Am I safe? And part of the answering of these questions is the youth having an opportunity to provide support to each other, the normalization of, yeah, I wonder about that too, or, oh, I think this is some good advice for you. And they really do give each other such beautiful advice. And we're there as the adult advisors and kind of experts in the room as well. And so we're able to fill in gaps or correct things a little bit if it's off. So it's kind of a best of both worlds where they get the peer support and an expert, trusted adult in a room.
These kids really have a lot of questions, and we've been talking about sex education for the past couple of weeks. And I'm curious about, I guess, where you think we are in terms of our ability to talk openly about this stuff. There's this interesting moment in the finale of season 3. Otis is in conversation with the school's ex-principal, and she's kind of challenging him on about how her generation knew how to conduct themselves and they knew what was important. And Otis responds and he says, well, the issues that me and my peers are talking about have always been there. People just haven't felt safe enough to raise them. That's what's changing. What did you think of that line from where you stand?
Absolutely. I think about actually David Sedaris says something about recognizing he's gay and having sex with somebody for the first time, or being sexual with them, and recognizing that he's inventing the wheel. And wait a second, we're always inventing the wheel because no one is told or taught anything real. And so we're all just trying to figure it out. And we need a space to learn real comprehensive sexuality education, relationship education, life skills, right? We need that. Why are we missing this? And at the same time, we're also culturally experiencing a very heavy dose of conservative understandings around sexuality that prohibit people from asking, that want people to wear gray and conform and fit in boxes and look appropriate. And I think the future that we're looking at, one of the things that I say is that if we're fighting, if we're getting pushback, we know we're doing something right. You're making moves, you're making movement, you're making momentum happen. And there's going to be force against that. But the force against that lets you know that you are making the waves, which is great.
The energy this show sparks in everyone we talk to was contagious. And it was that energy from our very own intern that inspired us to take a real look at this show. Anthony Howard has been with our team since last summer. He's an incredible human and a sex education superfan.
At each season drop, I find myself eagerly waiting to grab my remote, press play, and binge watch the latest season of the show in one sitting. The show explores sexual and gender identity and interactions that test each character's discomfort and make me reflect on my own.
Anthony brought together a round table of folks who see themselves and their relationships reflected in this show. Tyra Blizzard is a social activism influencer, and Claire Holland is a writer. Now, let's eavesdrop on their conversation. Here's Claire.
You know, I just think that there's this idea that there's either too much or too little sex on TV, but I think that the real problem is that there's not enough realistic sex shown on TV, and I think that's what's so amazing about this show, is that they really go there.
Yeah, definitely. I would love to know, I have a favorite character in mind, but I would love to hear from either of you. Tyra, let's go with you first. The character Cal is a non-binary and queer character in the show, and I would love to know, how did Cal's character factor into your own exploration of your own genderqueer identity?
I resonated so much with Cal, but I didn't understand why at the time because I was still identifying as a cis woman. I had not yet taken the time to unpack the meaning of gender within myself. Like I was doing that on my platform and talking about gender with other people, but never for myself. So once I started to unpack gender and realize that, you know, my relationship with womanhood wasn't my own idea, it was kind of something that was societally influenced, then I realized why I connected so much with Cal. And then being Black as well was just like, I finally understood why I just was so drawn to them.
Claire, what characters in the show do you most identify with and why?
Well, one of the characters who I just was so thrilled to see in this show was Lily, who is a character who throughout the show, she kind of has a journey. She discovers that she has this condition called vaginismus. The first time she tries to have sex, it just won't work. It won't go in, basically. And she discovers that she has this disorder that's like an involuntary clenching of the muscles, even though she really wants to have sex. And I have dealt with that in the past. I also had vaginismus. And it took me over 10 years to get a diagnosis and to get help. So, because I had never heard that term, even today, it's so rare to see people talking about it. So it's just incredible to see that in a storyline on TV.
Yeah, that's awesome that for both of you, you're kind of intersecting your own identities, whether that be your own gender or your racial identity, and then also your own experiences, specifically for you, Claire, in terms of the sexual disorder that you have experienced thus far. And I see myself also in Eric, just in terms of his Black queerness and being out and open. Not only is Eric an embodiment of how to be open in your truth and being confident in who you are, but then also I think it does explain that it's not all sunshine and rainbows, just in terms of there are people that do experience families that are not as understanding or don't have welcoming environments and safe spaces for where they can truly be who they are and live out their truth. And Claire, I want to turn to you again. Eric also pushes against the idea of masculinity. So why do you think this is important for folks to witness this on screen, this testing of this hypermasculine male?
Oh my gosh, I think it's so important, especially right now. I feel like we're in this very luckily, finally, happily empowering time for women. And I think that men are struggling a bit more to find their place and to really understand what masculinity is and what it can mean for them. It doesn't have to be this hyper macho thing. Adam is such a closed up character at the beginning, and through his relationship with Eric, he becomes so much more open and he learns how to express himself, talk about his feelings. He even wears makeup at one point and thinks he looks quite pretty. Also, Eric in his relationship with Otis, it's like a much more physical, friendly kind of relationship, I think, than we often see between two boys or two men. So yeah, I think this show just explores a lot of different kinds of masculinity and the way that you can be a man and relate to other men.
Yeah, definitely. And on the point and on the topic of relationships and also breaking down the barriers of what we deem to be the norm of what masculinity entails, I want to turn to a conversation that took place between Cal and Jackson. And Tyra, I want to know, how do you see the conversation between Jackson and Cal being almost a form of sex education for Jackson? I want to give a little bit more nuance and context around the piece. So Cal is a non-binary student from Minneapolis who shows up in season 3. One of Cal's storylines is that they develop a friendship with Jackson, a popular, high-achieving student who has up to this point identified as heterosexual. Jackson develops feelings for Cal, and since Cal is non-binary, Jackson begins questioning his heterosexuality. Let's listen.
I just don't think I'm queer.
I figured as much.
But I thought you were all about breaking out of boxes. So what does it matter if I'm queer or if I'm not?
Because I'm not a girl, and I'm worried you still see me as one.
Yeah, maybe I do. But I'm open. Like, I'm willing to learn.
Here's the thing. I'm still figuring out so much shit about myself I can't carry you to. And I still want to have fun when I can, because I feel so heavy all the time.
So, What does this mean?
It means that we can still be friends.
I do really like you.
I really like you too. I'm sorry that this isn't gonna work out.
That scene brings tears to my eyes every single time. Oh my goodness. I was just so happy with how the conversation went, in terms of, Jackson being a cishet man, actually taking the time to remove himself from the situation and determine whether or not he was able to pursue the relationship. And I don't see that very often, specifically from cishet men. I see a lot of anger, frustration, and confusion, and kind of fear of the unknown. So him taking that time to sit down and have a conversation with Cal was beautiful. And then the way that Cal responded, kind of choosing themselves over that potential relationship and explaining that they aren't responsible for carrying the burden and the labor of educating someone who is in that position of power and privilege over them. Like, it's Jackson's job to do that. And I think that conversation was so educational. I wish every conversation could go that way. So I'm just so in love.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to that there is still so much more learning to do. And not only does that learning and that education have to come from a movie series, but it can come around from the people that surround us on a day-to-day basis. Tyra, in what ways do you think the series can continue to explore these discussions of sexuality and tenderness in the next season of the show?
I think that they could really explore the definition of sex, like what sex actually means, and that sex doesn't always equal penetration. That's something that it took me forever to figure out. There's so many different aspects of sex and intimacy. And if they could explore kind of different ways to have sex and kind of reframe what it means, I think that's going to help a lot of people.
Yeah, definitely. That reframing of what sex is. I definitely agree with you on that. So the show would not be called Sex Education if not for the entrepreneurial spirit of Otis and his quest to educate his peers on sex and love. In what ways does the show accurately portray this reality of love and dating for young adults? Tyra?
I would say the messiness of it all, in the fact that young teenagers, young adults, we kind of are on our own to figure things out because, the older generations, older populations don't always feel comfortable telling us the truth and being straight up. So we're kind of out there just trying our best to figure it out. And I think that's what Otis was trying to do, is help other people figure it out. It was just so raw and real.
Claire Holland, Tyra Blizzard, and Anthony Howard. So yeah, I think it's fair to say that Team Embodied highly recommends you go watch this show if you haven't already. Thanks so much to everyone who shared their thoughts with us for today's episode. And big ups to our fabulous intern, Anthony Howard. Embodied is a production of North Carolina Public Radio WUNC, a listener-supported station. If you want to lend your support to this podcast and WUNC's other shows on demand, consider a contribution at WUNC.org now. Incredible storytelling like you hear on Embodied is only possible because of listeners like you. This episode was produced by Audrey Smith and Anthony Howard with editorial support from Amanda Magnus and Kaya Finlay. Jenny Lawson is our sound engineer, and Quilla wrote our theme music. This show is supported by Weaver Street Market, a worker and consumer-owned cooperative selling organic and local food at 4 Triangle locations in North Carolina. Now featuring online shopping with next-day pickup. weaverstreetmarket.coop. If you enjoyed this show, share it with a friend or post about it on social media and tag us. It really helps us spread the word, and it means so much. Until next time, I'm Anita Rao, taking on the taboo with you.